It's all yours.
Very good. So as was already said, interesting segue. We're going to look at the idea of mitzvah.
We did not plan this.
Did not plan this at all. Mitzvah and ethics, values. So many times we are confronted with the idea that, isn't it just about, being a good person, right? And if that's all it's about, like, how does that differentiate us from the rest of traditions, rest of the world, really? Because most religions have similar ideas, but in Judaism, there's a lot of sources behind the things that we value and the things that we do. So I want to look at those over the next few weeks. So the first question: what's a mitzvah?
A good deed.
Okay, so that's one.
Something you want to give to somebody, a good deed.
Well,
it's helping.
Okay.
And it's obeying the Ten Commandments.
Okay.
So all of those things that say thou shalt, those are the mitzvot that you do.
Okay.
Iris?
They are God directed.
Okay.
Okay. That at certain places we are told you will do this, you will.
Oh, so they're direct. You see God directed. You mean directed by God?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes,
That we are right.
They are specifics.
Right. Usually we translate mitzvah to English as a commandment, right? As a commandment. And I say that just because with Iris, that means if there's a commandment, that means there's a commander, right? So that's why in Iris' term that they're God directed, that they're directed by God. It's not uncommon for people to say a mitzvah is a good deed.
Right.
I would say that a good deed is a subset of mitzvot, right? Plural of mitzvah is mitzvot. It's a subset of mitzvot, but it's not the whole thing, right? So there's lots of mitzvot that you wouldn't necessarily categorize as a good deed, like not mixing wool and linen in your clothing. Okay, that's not really a good deed, right? But I'm sure most of the things that you would say as a good deed, you could then find some mitzvah that you would connect it to. Mitzvah, there's lots of different ways that I would translate it or explain it. The sense of commanded, right, gives that idea of a commander, but then also I think wraps up within it a sense of reward and punishment. So I try and stay away from that, as much as I can, because that's not a theology that I really hold on to. But I think of mitzvot as obligations, right?
Really?
Obligations, right? What are the things that we're obligated to do? And those obligations come from relationships. So the most intense relationship that we have, right, is with the divine, is with God. And so that's the highest, in some ways, the highest level of obligations. We all have relationships that we're in, and based on those relationships, we have different obligations, right? So I think about on a really limited sense, if you're walking down people maybe have heard me say this before, you're walking down the street and someone's walking the other way, you're in relationship to this person. You've never met this person before, right? And you'll never see them again. But you are in relationship with that person, and so you have obligations. What's an obligation that you have towards that person? Not minimally, right? Don't bump into the person, right?
Yeah.
And we might have structures built into place to set that up, right? So we might all know that you step to the right. So that you don't bump into the other person, right?
Unless you live in England.
I was gonna say, right? And if we have different cultures coming together, then sometimes those obligations and the way they're carried out bump into each other, and we're not exactly clear how to handle it. So you have other places. Some places might have a higher level of obligation to that person. You might be expected to smile and say good morning, right?
But even if I think we live in the meadows and we go for a walk. I don't have to know you. You're coming toward me. I'm going to say good morning.
That's what I'm saying, right? That's what I'm saying is, right?
Right.
But other places, right? If you lived in New York City, and you are walking your dog in the morning, you wouldn't say good morning to
depends on how
people.
you live.
You
Yes.
people, you can't. I
That's
mean,
weird.
all the people there. Good morning. Good morning. Good
Dog
morning.
walkers all say good
Maybe the
morning.
dog walkers do.
Yeah.
Maybe the dog
Walk
walkers
dogs
do.
with my son there.
Right. But
Yeah,
so
that
there.
would be
Thank you.
They all say hello to each
characterized
other.
as a mitzvah.
No. I'm giving sort of
Example of
examples of what do obligations, right? Or how do obligations come out of being in relationship, right? So you have higher levels of relationship. Let's thinking about the people that you live with at various times of your lives, right? There might be obligations that you have based on being in that type of relationship with somebody, right? Not to leave, dirty dishes in the sink, right?
If you're invited
Putting
somewhere,
putting down
consult with your
the
partner.
putting down the toilet seat, right?
Right.
If
Right?
you're invited
Very
somewhere, consult with the partner before you accept.
Great. Okay. Right. If you're making some plans or something like that, right? You can have a conversation with the
Make sure
partner
there's
first.
nothing blocking John's way when he's walking
Right.
with the walker. He can't get it out of
Right.
his way.
Good. Okay. Sometimes the things that people expect you to do might not make sense to you, right? Rabbi Artson talks about this, and he says that one time they have a rule: no shoes on the bed, right? No shoes on the bed, and he always thought it was a cleanliness thing, right? But he got home one time buying a brand new pair of shoes, and what is he needs to lace them up. So he takes them out and he puts them on the bed while he's lacing them up, and his wife goes crazy. What are you doing? There's shoes on the bed, right? So sometimes it might not always make sense, right? But we still do it. Why?
Because of the relationship.
Because of the relationship, right? Whether it makes sense to us or not. So we can think about mitzvot in the Torah, right? That we say, well, this doesn't make any sense, but it's there. It's because of the relationship that we have with God that we still do it, right? So mitzvot are obligations. They come out of relationship. The root of the word that we translate in Hebrew as commandment, similar root in Aramaic, means connection. That by doing these things, we're connecting, we're enhancing the relationship that we have with somebody else or something else, if we're thinking about mitzvot that impact the world around us, right? So it's a way that we make a connection between us and other people, between us and God's creation, right? And we might say between us and ourselves as well. How many mitzvot, the tradition says that we have?
613.
613. So we have a little text here from Talmud Bavli that speaks about this, right? And this is a small section from a larger conversation. Rabbi Simlai taught. Who wants to read that? Go ahead, Hannah.
Rabbi Simla taught there were 613 mitzvot stated to Moses in the Torah, consisting of 365 prohibitions corresponding to the number of days in the solar year, and 248 positive mitzvot corresponding to the number of a person's limbs.
Okay.
Negative mitzvot,
Okay,
thou
so, yeah.
shalt not.
Right.
Positive mitzvot, thou shalt.
Right, so
Now,
I
I never considered the negative ones as mitzvot. But if you're translating it as commandments,
Right.
then
Why,
absolutely.
why not? Why don't you?
I guess because I wasn't translating mitzvah as commandment.
Uh-huh. Oh, right.
Right.
If we always saw mitzvah as a good
Good
deed,
deed,
right?
then you're not-
Then it's
right.
not right.
Yeah.
Ronnie.
And how do you count things you don't do? I'm walking down the street and I don't kill the person I
But-
don't bump into
but that-
them.
those
I
are-
don't
those-
say
right.
negative things about my neighbor.
Right.
I don't, how do I, do
Those
I
are
get credit for that?
yes, those are what's called negative mitzvot,
Yeah, but do
right? Yeah.
So,
So-
how
so-
does one know? I mean, if there is
Yes,
in fact.
we are observing we are observing mitzvot all the time by not doing things, right?
Right.
Yes,
So-
I've never murdered somebody, right? So yes, I can check that one off.
But
that I,
again,
that I,
you
right?
don't do a mitzvot for the reward or for people
No,
knowing.
right.
So you're doing it to do.
Right.
Last night, there was a gentleman coming to our table. He needs a walker, and even without the walker, he's very shaky.
Mhm.
And his lady friend had knocked on his door a few times. He hadn't answered. He finally came to dinner, and there was his soup because she had placed the order. And the waitress had set on the tray all our dinner plates, and his was still on the tray. And he started to get up.
Mhm.
And you could tell this was not a man who should get up.
Right.
And she has a problem walking, so before he could get up, I went and I got it. Mostly because I didn't want him to hurt himself,
Sure.
you know.
Sure.
So, but you don't do it to get anything. It's
No,
because I
right.
wanted to prevent something worse happening.
Right.
Yeah,
So
but
so
that
just
still applies to the vaccine.
right. That's
I'm
right.
talking, how do you
Right.
count
You know,
when
but you're
you
not
don't
supposed-
do?
We
You're
don't.
not
Well,
supposed
first
to
of all,
count
we
it.
don't think that we
don't-
need to be
we don't
counted,
need to be
right?
counted.
Um,
Right.
So just to step back for a moment, just so that we make sure that everyone's clear, I put down here negative mitzvot and positive mitzvot. That terminology is used. It has there's no value. Usually you think of negative and positive as some sort of value. There's no value. It's just how they're phrased. That the negative mitzvot are the ones that are phrased not to do something.
Right.
Don't do this. Don't do that. Right. Those are the negatives. Right. Don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. Right. Any of those things. The positive are you should do something. Right. And within both of those, we could see things that have to us both sort of positive and negative values. So it's not about how we value them. So Ronnie, I think it's interesting. You know, you talk about how do we you know we could say, well, we're doing these mitzvot all the time, and that's really true, right? That in some ways, especially any of the thou shalt nots, we are continuously doing that, right? I was going to say something else about it. Oh yeah, so a lot of times people come to me and say, "Oh, Rabbi, I'm not very religious," right? And I think, well, does that mean like you're out robbing banks, right? Or or murdering? Like, what does that mean? It really means I don't go to synagogue very often. I don't keep kosher. And I don't keep Shabbat, right? Like those are the things that people are thinking about when they say I'm not very religious, right? But there's a whole host of other things that are out there, and we're going to look at some of them today, right? That are mitzvot, right? That you're doing all the time, both positive and negative. And why don't we count those, right, as things that we're doing as well, and the ways that we are observing. If we look back at this text for a second, the 613 mitzvot, 365 are negative, thou shalt nots, and 248 correspond to the number of person's limbs. Any meaning you can get out of that?
I'm confused.
What are you confused about?
Person's limbs?
Yes, so their anatomy understanding might not be as precise as what we think of, right? I don't know if we were to ask somebody who really knows about anatomy how many limbs are in a person's body. I don't know what number we would get, but this was bones, limbs, like bones in your body.
Maybe they're
Right?
just saying, don't be physical with someone, don't put your hands on someone.
Well, this is the positive, right? These are positive, right? These are the things that you.
Hey, I like your
when
hair,
that's
I like your arms.
not,
Have a nice arm.
Number of days, I
but
understand.
that's in the
Right, so
calendar.
365 is the as it says, the solar year, right?
No, I got it, I
Right.
got it.
Are the negatives, are the thou shalt nots.
Right. But the positive are the things that we do physically.
Right, okay, so
Oh,
the
okay.
positives, right, thou
Yeah.
shalt are the things that we have to, in some ways, engage our body
Helping a person
Like,
or something.
in order to do,
Self-feeding,
right?
Yes.
Although there might be positives that are more also just thinking as well, so it might not only be body, but it is that idea, right?
I
They're
was
more
thinking
active.
that
Uh-huh.
Ronnie sings in the Jewish chorale
Right.
because she loves to sing.
Mhm.
But she's also performing this wonderful mitzvah of bringing this music to so many people to enjoy. So it's another
Right.
mitzvah
Right.
of
Yeah,
doing
absolutely.
and relationship.
Right. And you could probably put it under a bunch of different categories, right? In terms of bringing joy, in terms of educating.
Right.
There's a lot of different things that we could look at. Okay, so yeah, so I think that the negative and the idea of them being connected to the number of days is that these are things that we should be thinking about continuously, right? Whether there's exactly 365 of them, and is something that we could question, but they set it up in such a way so that it's like, oh yeah, this is something we should be thinking about all the time, right? What are the ways that we control, if you will, our behaviors, right? Those are the negative mitzvot, the thou shalt nots, the keeping from doing something, and that's a constant. And then the 248 positive ones are connected to our body, right? That we're actively going out and doing. So we have this structure, negatives and positives. We also have a structure of mitzvot ben adam lemakom and mitzvot ben adam lechaveiro. Makom is another name for God. So mitzvot, this is mitzvot between a person, Adam, and God, is the first section. And the second is mitzvot between a person and chaver, his friend, right? His friend. So, think of a mitzvah and tell us which category would you put it in? Mitzvah ben adam lemakom or mitzvot ben adam lechaveiro?
Keeping kosher.
Okay.
Between man and God.
Great. Okay. Kashrut.
And Shabbat, keeping Shabbat.
Shabbat.
Not to have other gods before you.
Okay. One God.
Keeping the commandments.
Okay. That's a little bit.
Those could be
That's a little bit broad,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. We're talking about the mitzvah. Okay.
Do not covet
Your neighbor.
Okay.
wife.
So where does that go?
Have a
Chaveiro. Don't covet.
Also, who's not speaking evil of people.
Yes.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
That I see as mostly between man and man,
Right.
but
yeah.
it also has, I think, a God component.
Well, that's the interesting thing. There was another text I didn't end up bringing, but that it says that on Yom Kippur, right, when we ask for forgiveness, we can only ask for forgiveness for things between us and God.
God,
Got it.
right.
And anything between us and another person, we have to go to them directly. But when you've done something to hurt another person, you've also hurt God. So there is, like you say, there's a sort of a three-part connection to it. It's you, the person, and God. And so you have to go ask them for forgiveness, and then you can go to God and clear that up as well. Right? So yeah, so there's certainly that built into anything that's ben adam lachaveiro has a component of it being with God as well. We even just basically going back to the idea that we're created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, that each one of us has a piece of the divine in us, and so there is that part to it. Ronnie.
Kabed, as respect your parents.
Good. Kabed et avicha ve'et imecha, right? Honoring your father and mother, right?
But again, I think I see it as a big circle that everything's probably part of God.
Yeah.
And then there's within that another circle. I don't even see it as a Venn diagram.
Uh-huh.
If you're going to
Interesting.
believe in God, you're going to believe that anything you do ultimately is out of respect to
Right.
the wishes of this divine being.
Yeah. Right. But I think there's still ways to break it down a bit to say these definitely are between us and God.
Sure.
And these are really between us and other people, right? So we could go on. We could fill up the chart, right, of other things. But those are two different rubrics, two different structures for mitzvot, positive and negative, and then ben adam lemakom and ben adam lachaveiro, between us and between a person and God, and between a person and themselves. Okay? If we turn the page, we're going to see some texts about ethical mitzvot in the Torah. These all come from Leviticus chapter 19, and there's others, of course, throughout the Torah. So let's go around and we'll just read them one at a time. Ira, start with the first one.
You shall not pick your vineyard bare or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard, for you shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I, the Lord, am your God.
Okay, so we're told, right? We're told to leave part of our. This is if you're picking, right, from your vineyard or from a tree, that you should leave some of it there for the poor. Okay, the next one.
Yeah. You shall not steal, you shall not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God. I am the Lord.
And so here we have a little bit of both. Right? We have stealing, and then we have swearing falsely by God's name. And we could talk about how those two are connected in some way. But the first part is definitely more the sort of the ethical of not stealing. That's between us and another person, or dealing falsely with them. And then the idea of not swearing by God's name. Yep.
I just wanted to go back. I had something.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
First
Yep.
one I read, which is, I take this and I generalize it again to charity. That, I don't have a fruit tree.
Right.
But I worked and I make money and
Yes.
I need to share that.
Correct, right, and those are
That's
certainly there's ways that we can implement the things, and the rabbis do this along the way. If we see what kind of in when they talk about Shabbat rules for Shabbat specifically, we talk about the Av Melacha, sort of the Av literally means father, right? So the first mitzvah, and then what are the toldot? What are the generations that come out of it, right? So you've got something like around Shabbat where it says, you're not supposed to plow a field, right? Create the burrow, or I think that's the furrow where you're going to plant seeds, right? So from that, the rabbis talk about, and this was certainly more relevant in their time, if they had a dirt floor, right? What would happen if you pulled a chair or a bench across that wood floor, right? So you've got the Av Melacha, don't do this one thing, and from it comes ways that it's sort of implemented. So what we can do, we can get into
And the
that
wife
one
says,
and
I
whatever.
told you,
But-
God said, don't make a furrow
right?
on Shabbat. Pick up the chair.
But the idea that it's in some ways the same exercise of what you're saying.
Same.
I don't have a vineyard, right? But I can, right, take a piece of what I have, right, and leave it for the poor, right? Give it to the poor. Okay. Ronnie, the next one. You shall not.
You shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord.
Okay. Again, there's lots of ways to look at this and say, oh, okay, so I'm not supposed to insult the deaf, right? But maybe there's also other understandings of it, that really what it's saying is, don't take advantage of somebody else's limitation.
I'm sorry, it's political.
Okay.
I don't even want to
understand.
Taking advantage, right? Don't take advantage of somebody else's limitations,
How you
right?
help the guy with the walker.
Right?
Yeah.
If somebody's not, somebody's not here one time, right? Doesn't mean that we should talk about that person, right? They're not literally deaf, but they aren't in vicinity, right? So there's lots of different ways that you could look at it. Placing a stumbling block before the blind. There's a lot of conversations like should somebody who's Jewish. I had this question. I ended up working in college in a supermarket, and then I was bagging for a while, and then they decided to put me in the deli. Right, so here I am selling non-kosher meat, right? Ham and shrimp and everything else, right? if somebody is Jewish, right, comes to the deli, like, am I able to, right, serve them, help them, right? Am I putting a stumbling block before the blind, right? By supplying something that they're not supposed to have, right? What about somebody who sells a gun, right? So is that something that you're allowed to do, not allowed to do, right? That kind of a thing. So there's lots of different ways to build on this. Don't put a stumbling block.
What is the answer to that?
Of
Are
what?
you allowed to serve the person?
Well, so one of the ways of looking at it is the stuff, right, that you're selling, let's say, is it readily available someplace else, right? Like, it wouldn't take much for them to, instead of coming into Publix, to go down to wherever it is, the Winn-Dixie, right?
So
right?
in other words, they're
So
gonna get it anyway.
they're gonna get
so
it. They're gonna get it anyway, right?
Okay.
If it's something that they wouldn't be able to,
Right.
then there's more of a question around
Okay,
it.
so the
right?
gun dealer is a totally
Could be a very different situation,
okay.
right?
But doesn't everyone have in their own mind, it's between them and God. If I wanted bologna and you were serving me and I'm Jewish,
there's like
isn't
aiding and
that
abetting, right?
between?
Yeah, but I shouldn't do something that's going to have some sort of negative effect on somebody else, right? So maybe selling bologna, like, that's, we're thinking it's kashrut. It's not on lots of people's minds. It's not as big of a deal. But what about selling cigarettes, right?
Yeah.
I'm even to minors, anybody, right? I'm creating a situation where they're going to do something that is harmful to their lives, right? And I am.
Did you stay in that job long?
I stayed until the place closed down.
Were you wearing a
It
kippah?
closed because he wasn't
I was wearing a
selling to the
kippah,
Jews.
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
it, now that's
Yeah.
an interesting
Yeah,
dilemma.
no, I did. I wore a kippah when I worked there.
That is a very interesting
Yep.
dilemma.
Yeah, I get it.
But so
We
yeah,
can
so it is.
also
It can relate to things that have to do with really putting things out there that can endanger somebody else's life.
On the other hand, it is, what right do we have
To
to
tell somebody else.
That's what I mean.
judge what someone else, letting somebody harm themselves?
Right.
I guess there are gradations.
Sure.
It would be very difficult. I mean, you could have requested working in a different department.
Yep.
but-
Right.
But, I look at a continuum
Right.
here.
There's very little of this that we're gonna find is black and white, right? There's gonna be a lot of different gray to this. But I do think that it's something that we should at least be thinking about, right? A lot of these things.
They do have Hebrew National bologna.
Of
Yeah.
course.
Yes,
But then you put it on the same slicer as the other.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Well, that's true, in public.
When you were talking, Iris, in my head popped assisted suicide.
Uh-huh.
I
Right.
was thinking that too,
Mhm.
So what,
yeah.
how do the rabbis feel about that?
So we could go into a whole assisted suicide.
Because that's a big deal, when you said.
I will
to
jot that
continue.
down as a topic to.
Yeah.
Because that's a big
Yeah.
deal.
Okay.
You know
That
what,
is a
that
very
is,
good
that
deal.
is
Why?
that's a very good deal.
Yeah.
And
Huge.
Topic of working.
although
That's
I'll take a doctor.
you know,
any way that we can generate topics that are going to be of interest for me I'll prepare that and
Yeah,
we'll,
that
and
would
we'll,
be
and we'll
very
look at that.
It's not just suicide, it's dealing with someone who says, I don't want any more medication.
Exactly,
I
well,
wanna
that's
allow
what
things to,
What I went through last
Absolutely.
year.
Right.
yeah,
Right.
with your
well,
mom.
wait, that,
But we've all been through this.
Right. Yeah.
And how do we deal with
Right.
this?
Right. So we spoke a little bit 2 weeks
When
ago.
you talked about.
We did a schmooze
Yeah.
on medical directives,
Right.
So, but I can go into more detail.
Yeah,
I
that would-
think maybe we did it in the first. I
We
think we
did.
did in the first round here as well. So I can look at it specifically more coming from this idea
I like
of
that.
assisted suicide. but it's wrapped up in some of those ideas around the medical directives as well. Right, yeah.
You know,
That's right.
just when Marty had his first stroke,
Mhm.
it was actually happening in the ER.
Mhm.
And our wonderful friend Nathan had gotten a wonderful neurosurgeon to come in, and the man who came in looked at Marty, and he took me aside and he said, "Your daughters are here and you better talk to them right now. You're Jewish and I'm Jewish. If he doesn't stop bleeding, he would be a vegetable, and I'm not going to operate on someone and leave them in that
Right.
state.
Mhm.
So if this is what you and your family want, you've got some decisions to make."
Right.
And thank God the bleeding stopped and we didn't have to
Good.
face that.
Right, right,
But those are,
right.
well, they're
You
they're
certainly will.
important things for us to consider.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
what if it had not been a Jewish doctor who understood that whole ethic? It could have been someone else.
Right, right.
You know, who's only thinking about, we're gonna operate,
Do the next thing.
and whatever happens, happens.
Kate, read the next
Yeah.
one.
Okay, waiting for my turn.
1916.
I know. Do not deal basely with your countrymen. Do not profit by the blood of your fellow. I am the Lord.
Right. We have to keep in mind how our actions affect others. We want to make a profit, right? But if it's to the expense of somebody else, we have some restrictions on that. Sheila, next one.
You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. I am the Lord. Well,
Some of these are pretty hard, aren't they?
They are hard. They really are. Judy?
The
Who's the stranger?
This one. Sorry, the stranger.
Right there. Oh, okay. Now, the stranger who resides with us, with you, shall be to you as one. Shall be to you, okay. You shall love the stranger who resides with you, okay, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, the Lord your God.
I am the Lord your God, right?
Wasn't that
Okay.
that you do unto others as you would have others do unto you?
Okay, so interesting. It's not in the Torah, right? And it's not, and even in Jewish tradition, it's not framed that way.
Okay.
In Judaism, it's framed the opposite. Don't do to somebody else what is harmful to you. But it comes from the idea here of you shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? And it's really tied up in that as well, right? Okay, and the last one, Becky.
You shall faithfully observe all my laws and all my rules. I am the Lord.
Right, sort of recapping or
Right,
summing everything up. So we've spoken about a lot of these. We've spoken about what are some implications of them and how we can get from the mitzvah to, or the what's in the Torah, to ways that we carry it out in our own lives. We haven't spoken about a commonality running through all of them. What's common with each of these?
I am the Lord your God.
Right, okay? They all end in some way or another. I, the Lord, am your God. I am the Lord. I am the Lord. I am the Lord. I am the Lord your God. Anything like that, right?
Mhm.
A lot of mitzvot that we have are just stated. And the rabbis derive a lot of mitzvot from things that are in the Torah that aren't necessarily even stated as laws. But they certainly don't all have, every time, this I am the Lord, or I am the Lord your God. This collection in this section of Leviticus, right, most of them have this ending to the statement, right? What does that mean to us, right? These kinds of laws, these kinds of mitzvot, most of them are ethical. Most of them are ways that we're dealing with other people. Why have the "I am the Lord your God" as part of it?
I think this is, God is telling us, this is how you lead your life. This is how you follow my commandments.
Okay.
I think he's underlining, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
It's an underline, in my head, it's an underlining that ethical behavior is still, is holy behavior.
Mhm.
It's part of the respect that one must give the divine.
Good. So it goes back to that thing, that the way of looking at things that I mentioned earlier, where people say, well, I'm not very religious, right? Think about
Right.
the ways that we live our lives, right?
Mhm.
If we're keeping this stuff in mind as we're going through our everyday, and sometimes I think in some ways, going back to Ronnie said, it's just natural, right? It's just the way that we behave.
Yeah.
But other times we really have to pause and be like, okay, what do I do in this situation, right? And we really want to weigh out some of these values before making a decision, before taking some sort of action. There's Jewish, right, stuff there, right, that helps us, instruct us towards what some of those actions should be, right?
And that is what Judaism brings to this world that is different from other faiths, which have many of, as you said, many of the same ideas of charity and so forth. But there is a uniqueness in the Judaism, and I take a look at Leviticus 19:18, and that was what the shooter went into Tree of Life to kill people over. He didn't believe that.
Mm-hmm. Right, right.
And that was, the issue. So, I've always looked at these things, and, having a good name
Mm-hmm.
is very important to me. I really care about that.
Right.
And I have kind of joked and said, yeah, take a look at the Torah, there's a lot of good stuff in there. Well, there's a lot of good stuff if you have the same kind of value I have, of being an ethical person, and there are more things here of how we want to live, and it goes again with what you introduced. That's a part of it.
Mhm.
I watched my parents live their life that way too. So
That's how we
that is what is to me uniquely
Sure.
valuable about
Right.
Judaism. And I don't know how many of you saw the editorial in the Herald Tribune on Monday, where they talked about the community study and how high the percentage is of giving charity and doing volunteering work and so forth
Yes.
within the Jewish community.
I read it
It was
this morning.
very positive.
Yeah.
What I was gonna say, having sat in a Lutheran church more Sundays than, everything I read that's positive, I can trace back to the Old Testament.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I know they're getting it, but they don't understand
Right.
where it came from originally
Right.
and how it came.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I sat in just at the beginning, the first half hour or so of the class yesterday with Stephen Stark Reamer, and he's talking. He's going to be talking about these Judaism and basically Judaism and Christianity as sibling traditions, as opposed to how we normally think about it as parent-child, right? That Christianity came out of Judaism, but rather they were around and developing it in many ways at the same time. And they're basically two traditions that came out of biblical Judaism. And coming out of biblical Judaism is what we might call rabbinic Judaism, right? Well, we don't practice biblical Judaism anymore, right? We practice rabbinic Judaism, and Christianity comes out at the same time. And I remember going to Greek Orthodox church in Cyprus, and they don't have pews. You don't sit. You stand. They've got armrests to help, right? They have armrests to help support you, and they had a little pamphlet, as sometimes synagogues have, right, describing the sanctuary and the service and all that stuff. So it says, why do we stand? There's a text from, I think it started with a T, Thomas, Timothy, somebody in the Christian tradition, that says that when two people are together, God's presence is with them. Right? And if God's presence is with them, then you stand, right? And I thought, oh, that's very interesting. In Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of Our Ancestors, right, Sayings of Our Ancestors, there's an almost exact same quote, right? When two people are together, God's presence is with them. And I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense. Like, these two traditions are developing at the same time. They've got the same teachings coming out. So we could say, yes, everything that that Christianity is talking about comes from the Jewish Bible, comes from Judaism. Or we could see it and say, look, it was all developing at exactly the same time. Ronnie, you were going to share.
I just was gonna, I'm sorry, I was gonna not challenge what Iris said, but maybe help redefine, because you said this, that's what you love about, what you think is unique about the Jewish religion. I don't think it's unique to our religion. I think it was unique at the time, because we were the first religion to have these ethics. I do believe that other religions possess, and share them. I think what's unique is that we came up with the idea. I don't mean to take issue, but
two things. One, what I wanted to say is I misquoted. It was 1934, not 1918,
Right. Okay,
which
right,
was
right.
the.
Yeah.
That's right. I
Right.
looked down and said the
Right.
wrong thing. I think that there still are parts that are unique.
totally unique.
Yeah, I really do. And it may just be in, I respect what you're saying, and I think there are a lot of things that
I'd like to think there are things that
have been,
totally, I just don't
have
know.
been
Right.
taken. So,
Be an
yeah,
interesting question.
yeah.
Right. Okay, let's look at the next page. We're going to make this move now from biblical sources, right? And we really looked in one area, in this area of Leviticus. There's things that we'll find in lots of places throughout the Bible. And in fact, we're going to quote some of them here. We're going to move to now Talmudic, right? The time of the rabbis, which the Talmud has material in it anywhere from the turn of the millennium, right as the Judaism is changing because of the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, through the early rabbis with the Mishnah, and then some of the later rabbis of Talmudic period in the 5th and 6th century. So this is from the Talmud itself. Jeff, you want to read that?
And Rabbi Chama, son of Rabbi Hanina, says, what is the meaning of that which is written? After the Lord your God shall you walk, and him shall you fear, and his commandments shall you keep, and unto his voice shall you hearken, and him shall you serve, and unto him shall you cleave.
Okay, so that's the whole verse, but what they quote in the Talmud itself is just the bold, right? So you see there's bold and there's regular. The bold is what's the actual text, and the regular font is stuff that the editor has put in to help smooth things out a little bit. So really what the piece of the verse that they're looking at is, after the Lord your God shall you walk. Okay, continue.
But is it actually possible for a person to follow the divine presence?
Thinking physically, right? Can we really walk right behind God, right? After the Lord your God you shall walk. And this is why, right, a lot of people say, oh, but it's metaphor, right? And so great. So then I'll say, well, if this is metaphor, then really anything in the Torah, and I agree with this, really anything in the Torah should be seen as metaphor. Right? 600,000 Israelites leave Egypt, right? 600,000 men, which means like 2 to 3 million people, right?
Right.
Okay, I think that's a metaphor, right? The world's created in 7 days. I think that's metaphor, right? So I really, this summer I taught the 16-year-olds at camp, the oldest group of kids at camp, and was talking to them about process theology, which is something that I got from Rabbi Artson, and I really think that it's a pretty solid theology. And I was telling them, they were asking me, well, what about the stories in the Torah? Don't you believe that they happened? And I said, not really. Like, I don't take them as fact, right? I take them as truths. And at one point, one of them asked, so can you point to anything in the Torah that you think really happened? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, it doesn't matter to me, right? So this idea of walking after God, no, we're not talking about, right? God's here and we're behind and we're walking after God. What are we talking about? Go ahead.
But hasn't it already been stated? For the Lord your God is a devouring fire, a jealous God, and one cannot approach a fire.
Okay, so this is his reasoning, right? We can't walk after God because we'll be consumed. Right? If we think about Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's sons, who go into the temple, into the Holy of Holies to bring an offering that they weren't asked to do, what happens? They get consumed, right? They're burned up, right? God is a devouring fire, right? Okay, go ahead. He explains.
He explains, rather the meaning is that one should follow the attributes of the Holy One, blessed be Him.
So this is what we're talking about, right? Following after the Lord you shall walk means do the things that God does, right? He provides several examples. Go on.
Just as He clothes the naked, as it is written, and the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skin and clothed them. So too should you clothe the naked.
Go ahead.
Just as the Holy One, blessed be He, visits the sick, as it is written with regard to God's appearing to Abraham following his circumcision, and the Lord appeared unto him by the terebinths of Mamre.
Yep.
So too shall you visit the sick. Just as the Holy One, blessed be He, consoles mourners, as it is written, and it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed Isaac his son. So too should you console mourners. Just as the Holy One, blessed be He, buried the dead, as it is written, and he was buried in the valley in the land of Moab. So too should you bury the dead.
Okay. So here we have examples of clothing the naked, visiting the sick, consoling mourners, and burying the dead. Are actions that we see God taking in the Torah, right? And if God does them, those are the things that we should do. Right? And in some ways, we can read that back into this the constant that I talked about of these mitzvot in Leviticus. What does it mean? I am the Lord your God. These are the things that I would do. These are the things that I value, and those are the things that you should do. Right? And we're supposed to emulate. We're supposed to be like God, act in a divine way. Ron.
I'm still hung up on the fact that you said you don't believe anything in So, I mean, you can't even point to the time of slavery in Egypt and say, yes, I believe that happened?
I don't think, I'll use some nuanced language that in some ways is how David Wolpe spoke about it a number of years ago when he got in trouble for saying a similar thing. He's got up in his congregation in LA, which is there's a lot of Persian Jews there, and they take a very literal view of things. And he said that the Exodus, that there's no evidence that he has that the Exodus happened as it's written in the Torah. Right? Is it possible, right, that there was some group of people in Egypt, and they were enslaved, and they left Egypt. Yeah, I think that's possible. And Richard Elliott Friedman, who's the author of his famous one is Who Wrote the Bible, and he's got some other thing. He sort of continues to advance his and refine his theories of things. Just recently had another book out, and I heard a lecture by him that he said that the people that came out of Egypt were probably the Levites, and they came then into Canaan, and they banded together groups of people that were already there within the land, but they were the literate ones. Right? They had stories, they had texts that they then started teaching to other people, and sort of created the what we know of as the 12 tribes and things like that through that way. But 600,000 men, from the age of 20 to 50, and these, the hail and locusts and all the death of the firstborn. No, I don't see it having happened that way.
But
Good story.
we.
Good story,
Yeah,
and we get a
but-
lot out of
but-
it. We get a lot
but
of meaning
we-
out of it.
Yeah,
Right?
but we teach important things through stories.
Right.
And that's a very effective way of teaching. And there were very important lessons about all of our ancestors that
Right.
came through all of that.
And these very bright 16-year-olds, right? I mean, they pushed and pushed and pushed on it, right? And asked questions that are really appropriate, like, well, then how is it any different than a fairy tale, right? And that's not an easy question to answer, right? And the difference is, I would say, is the importance that we place upon it, right? This is a holy text because we've made it a holy text, right? And because it has weathered the time, right? This is not something that was just written last week and we've chosen to follow it, right? This is 3,000 years old, right? And traditions, some traditions that probably go older than that, and it's something that has been pored over, studied over, right? Taken apart, put back together again, over and over and over and over again, in a way that fairy tales, right, have not, right? Go ahead.
Wait a minute, this is.
But even fairy tales are about good and
Yeah.
bad.
Ronnie and then Becky.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Right?
Go,
Go ahead.
Ronnie.
The good and bad of people.
Do you think it's the word of God?
I think that it is a human understanding of their interactions with God.
That I can buy.
Right. I think that it's the human interaction, the human understanding of the interactions with God. Do I think, right, do I believe that there were probably a group of people that stood at some mountain, right, and had an experience that they used language of God to describe? Absolutely, right? And that was they felt like they were in the presence of God? Absolutely, right? And then they recorded these stories using that kind of language. Becky.
Just as every good piece of literature,
Mhm.
and trust me, this is a good piece of literature.
Oh, it's a very good piece.
Exactly,
Right.
and is taught as a good piece of literature.
Some places.
In many places,
right.
actually, and many universities.
Right.
This teaches a very good story,
Mhm.
okay? And is passed down through many years because it has very real stories that we adhere to.
Mhm.
It teaches lessons that we adhere to.
Right.
That's what makes it so valuable. And that's just as Shakespeare,
Mhm.
which teaches lessons as well.
Right.
This has survived because of that. And that's what makes it so valuable. Because we learn from it.
Mhm. Right, and I think that I think that you're right? You can read other things. You could read Shakespeare, you can read fairy tales and get
Right.
lessons from them.
Exactly.
But in some ways, Iris, what you were saying before is that this covers the breadth of human experiences.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
There's another text in Pirkei Avot that says that you turn it and turn it, everything is within it. Right?
Exactly.
Everything, right, that you can think of experiencing, you can go back and find information about sources to support, things to guide your life within the Torah. It's all in there, right?
Which is
and
why people
you're
go
not
to
gonna
it.
and you're not gonna find that in Shakespeare,
Shakespeare.
right? In the same.
Well, you'd have to really look.
Right. You're not gonna find
You can, but you
Okay,
can really.
so here we have these things. We're supposed to follow after God, meaning emulate God and do those things in the world. Then I got just a few more sources. Psalm 15 gives us a lot of different ideas. A Psalm of David. Lord, who may sojourn in your tent, who may dwell in your holy mountain? He who lives without blame, who does what is right, and in his heart acknowledges the truth, whose tongue is not given to evil, who has never done harm to his fellow or borne reproach for his acts toward his neighbor, for whom a contemptible man is abhorrent, but who honors those who fear the Lord, who stands by his oath even to his hurt, who has never lent money at interest or accepted a bribe against the innocent. The man who acts thus shall never be shaken, right? That the more we do the right, clear, ethical things, the more solid our foundation, right? The man who acts thus shall never be shaken. We have a foundation because of these, and these, of course, are just examples, right? Not the whole gamut of things, but examples of ethical living. Micah 6:8 tells us, he has told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk modestly with your God. Right? And that's a text that a lot of we hear from a lot of faiths quoting Micah, that this is really what we're supposed to do. Now, Sheila, at the top of the back page, we get to that quote you were asking before. Go ahead.
Talmud Bavli, Shabbat 31a.
Right.
What is hateful to you, do not do to another.
Right. So the story is that somebody interested in converting, or it's possible that he was just looking to pull the leg of a couple of rabbis, went to Rabbi Shammai and says, teach me the whole Torah. I'll convert, right, if you teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. And Rabbi Shammai, it doesn't just send him away. It says like he beat him with a ruler, basically, right? Get out of here, right? You're mocking me and you're mocking our tradition. Man goes to Hillel and says, teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. And Hillel says, what's hateful to you, do not do to another. The rest is commentary. And there's the idea that everything else in the Torah and in our tradition is there to support this idea of what's hateful to you, do not do to another. And as I said before, that comes from the line earlier of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, to love your neighbor as yourself. Right? And you show that love by not doing the things that you don't like, right? So this is like a lot of people say this is the key element in Judaism, and everything else is commentary.
Rabbi,
Yep.
Can I interrupt you?
Please.
Oh, I have a real problem with the last one.
Okay.
You should not hate your fellow in your heart, love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
I won't mention names, but there's a certain person that I think we all know, does hateful things, horrible things, says horrible things, hurtful things. How am I supposed to love that person?
It's not easy. Right? It's not
I
easy.
mean,
Right?
it's almost impossible.
Yeah, but
Right.
you don't wish that person any harm.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
the
not harm
time.
like he's dead kind of a thing,
Well,
but
that's the point.
It's hard.
No.
I don't do that. I won't wish him.
Right.
No.
I would say
Everyone
I would say that first thing is to recognize that it's hard, right?
Right.
Even somebody who you care about deeply, when they do something that displeases you, you might at times find it hard to express that love, right, towards them. Take that to an extreme, somebody who, one, you don't know really much at all, and two, they're doing things on a regular basis that you find distasteful, abhorrent, whatever else, right?
You
Okay.
could wish him well on his retirement.
There are, it makes it very difficult, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing. The other thing is that the piece of love your neighbor as yourself sometimes is turned around to thinking about what's our relationship to ourselves, right? What does it mean that in order to love somebody else, to show that love, you first have to love yourself, right? And that's a difficult piece for a lot of us, in just even, I'm sure for all of us, in different parts, right? That there's parts of ourselves, right? There's parts of ourselves that we don't like either, right? And how do we embrace that still and right? I was talking to somebody yesterday, and he was asking about the blessing for most of the sons of Jacob in this past week's reading, but certainly for Reuven, like it's really not very positive, right? Not very nice. And I pointed out that, first of all, when Jacob blesses Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, it says this is a blessing. Right? When it comes to his sons, he says, let me tell you about the future days. And does that mean like the end of time? Does that mean, 20 years from now? It's not exactly clear, but he's saying what's gonna happen in the future. And then what he points out are things that are based on him really knowing his sons, right? And it's not, I'm blessing you with this tragedy or something like that, right? It's more like, you keep doing what you're doing, and
This is
what's going to end up happening, right? But you have the ability to change that, right? You have the ability to say, I don't want that to be the logical conclusion of what I'm doing now. I'm going to make changes in my life, right? And so hopefully he's expressing love, right, to his children, even though they've done some things over time that have been distasteful to him, right? Being able to express that can then direct them towards making changes in their lives so that doesn't end up being, right, what ends up happening later on. Right.
I'm reminded of like Oprah Winfrey, who has battled her weight her whole life. And the latest thing she's now saying, which really speaks to me too, because I'm constantly on a diet, is healthy is the new skinny. And she's trying to accept where she's at,
Right.
as long as she's healthy.
I like that.
And that's what she's preaching now. That's her latest thing. Healthy is the new skinny. And we're talking about loving yourself.
Right.
Because she, obviously her self-image was always around her weight.
Right. Yep.
And for many of us, for me, I can just speak for myself, it's part of it, and so I think that I love seeing that in her.
Right.
That she has finally,
But
where did you
there
see that?
is another.
Actually, there's an article in Parade, I think,
yeah.
even Sunday
Sunday's
about
paper.
it, that quoted that, but I've heard it from her before.
But the other thing is, you look at Oprah Winfrey and what she's accomplished in her life from when she started, from when she started, right, from her background, and being told she was stupid. And you see how successful she is. And in spite of that, there's a part of her that didn't like some part of herself
Mhm.
and couldn't accept herself the way she is. So, I mean, we all have something.
That's all about women and self-image.
Yeah.
You know,
There's a
we're
big piece of
told
that.
that
Yeah.
Certainly a big piece of that.